Hello everyone, this is Philosophy of the People with Stefan Bertram and no Ben Burgess. Because Ben's moving back to Mexico. And this week would perhaps be more appropriately called Social Science for the People. Because with Ben being away, I'm going to do something about what I actually study as an academic, discourse analysis, specifically doing some discourse analysis of, well, not the situation in Palestine, but the discourse around the situation in Palestine that exists in the West, and specifically on the left in the West. Um, I'm going to take advantage, and it might be boring or it might be cool, of the fact that Restream now has a presentation, an inbuilt PowerPoint feature, which was great for me because it meant that I could basically have a script while having to write far, far less words than I would otherwise. Which was especially useful because Ben sprung me this on Friday that he wouldn't be able to do the show. And at that time, I was still feeling I had had a week of poor health, which turned out not to be anything, but I was just really dehydrated. I would also note, before we begin, that while Restream does have this integrated feature of this PowerPoint, it doesn't have an integrated feature of a good arrangement of the PowerPoint and the video of the people. I'm probably going to be doing it like this, but there's a lot of this terrible option. There's this one, and then I think this is probably the least bad one, but it's just ridiculous that there's just so much of the screen not filled. Maybe I'll leave it on this one for now. Because the only alternative is doing it like this, in which case I may as well not be here. So, why and how should the left care about Palestine? The YouTube title was a bit base without entirely being fake. Because I am going to talk about why the left should care about Palestine, but a lot of the emphasis is how the left should care about Palestine, and specifically how a lot of the left goes about talking about Palestine in a way which I think is not useful at all. So we're going to go through, starting with what I take to be the two big forms of discourse around Palestine on the left, which I call the humanitarian discourse and the resistance discourse, both of which I take to be bad, to not grasp a situation in useful ways, to have features which are useful, but to overall not be very good. To then move on to discuss briefly mainstream discourse around Palestine, just kind of for context, and then to take a step back and ask why should the left care about Palestine? Going over the moral issue, the political issue, the strategic issue, and so on. Humanitarian discourse about humanitarian situations isn't bad, but why is it a humanitarian situation? Why are we talking about it as if it's a humanitarian situation? It's also a war. It's a war between armed groups. It's not, as it's portrayed by some, merely a terrorization of a civilian population by a military entity, but it's a conflict between military actors. That for people who aren't in the Give Them an Argument chat was a post in the Give Them an Argument chat. It's not a war, says someone in the Give Me an Argument chat. I think it is. Then to move on to discuss more marginal left discourse about Palestine, which is, kind of more marginal things like more systems-based views of it, which end up being quite cynical emphasis is on like marginal leftist groups in Palestine. Gent suggests that I need to, before moving on to talk about Palestine, make clear that Israel has a right to defend themselves and to not commend, to condemn Hamas. And then finally, I'm going to try and talk about what would be a more positive and functional left discourse around Palestine. I do like this a lot more than having to read off my notes, because this way I can actually read chat without completely losing the thread of what I'm saying. So what is this humanitarian discourse? It apes and follows a liberal humanitarian discourse, which is not exactly the mainstream discourse around Palestine in the West, but is certainly a prominent one, which has endangered like a lot more support since this last war, and it's basically kind of the liberal response to these terrible events to recharacterize what's happening in Palestine as a humanitarian issue. In this imagination, Palestinians are passive subjects, where the most clear image that we get of them is like of the injured child or the injured civilian, who is imagined as this subject who is passive, but has the general virtues that we ascribe to any human being, that they should not be horribly blown up by bombs and so on, but without any active role on their own part. They don't have anything to do for themselves. They're merely just these passive subjects who have this thing inflicted upon them, and hopefully by something we can do, we can stop this infliction or ameliorate this infliction, and so on and so on. The other kind of image of Palestinians that are portrayed here are kind of doctors and so on, and aid workers and journalists and poets and so on, kind of highly virtuous, highly educated members of the Palestinian community. But the resistance factions and Hamas and so on may as well not exist in this image. Israel and the IDF secret agent. It's. I think this is really easy, to be honest. I don't know why people complain about live streaming and doing all this stuff. It's actually very easy. Israel and IDF are active, but the reasons for this activity, why they're doing what they're doing, isn't clear, or it emerges out of kind of like some kind of generic badness, like the same kind of badness that maybe like Putin has, or something like this, where kind of authoritarian, anti-human rights actors do bad things because they're just kind of bad. And the actions of Israel are, these actions of the Israel and IDF are mediated through a relationship with the West, and especially with the US state. They're taken to have power over Israel that they don't use, but why they don't use it is normally unclear. They're always appealing for the West to finally stand up, but the reasons why the West hasn't stood up so far aren't really clear, which is a real big problem for a discourse to have. Because if you're trying to change people's minds on an issue, trying to change an entity's mind on an issue, well, not its mind, its position, its policy on an issue, you should have a clear understanding of why it's not currently doing it. I think the only kind of reason that appears here is and this is something I study a lot in my PhD, this idea that people aren't aware. And so around Palestine, like you have this framing of eyes on Rafah, where the idea is, the problem is that people aren't looking enough. They aren't staring enough at the problem. And if they just saw what the problem was, then they would change their minds. When, of course, like the people in the West, in the Western state, like Biden and Sunak and so on, especially, well, probably less Biden, but definitely the people who actually run the US, and run the State Department, they know that like babies are getting decapitated by Israeli bombs in Rafah. The problem isn't they aren't aware of this, it's that's just not how they're making the decisions. You can't make the situation so humanitarian terribly for them to change their mind because they're not making their decisions based on humanitarian concerns for the most part. Um, the heroic actors in this model are some governments, so like Ireland, some, and to be clear, some Western governments. As I'll discuss in the next point, regional actors basically don't exist in this model. Um, but some kind of Western progressive governments are taken to be heroic actors, um, as well as Western protest movements, and then this kind of network of international courts, the rest of the UN, NGOs, aid groups, and all these kinds of, like the PMC world government, uh, NGO world, all this kind of stuff. Regional actors like Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran, the Syrian resistance factions, the Iraqi resistance factions, basically aren't discussed, aren't talked about. Um, the only regional actor which gets talked about is Egypt, where they are appealed to on the same kind of humanitarian basis. Where it's like, oh, Egypt is also sometimes blocking aid from going into Gaza, but again, it's not really clear why they're doing that. While the Houthis and the Hezbollah, they're just disappeared from the discourse. They don't exist in the discourse the same way Hamas don't exist in the discourse. The idea that this is a war, this is a regional war, um, where Hamas are obviously outmatched, but then on the northern front you have Hezbollah engaged in these in like quite extensive military operations. Within the humanitarian discourse, that's completely disappeared. It doesn't exist at all. What's wrong with the humanitarian discourse? From a left perspective, for a left perspective, why shouldn't leftists be taking up this perspective? It's fundamentally, really fundamentally, a liberal one. Like if we take this as a humanitarian problem, we take Palestinians as a charity case. One obvious problem is what is the role of the Western worker in this image? And ultimately, it might be, I think some Western leftists struggle with it, but the person spoken to by a Western left discourse should be the Western worker. That should just be completely straightforward. That's not up for discussion in this video. If you think something else, then hard luck. What is the position of the Western worker if passed into a charity case? Is then the Western worker like a charity giver? The Western worker within any leftist discourse should be understood as oppressed, as a group which should not be going around giving charity because they're such, high up, on top of a pyramid, but they're part of a global network of exploitation where they need to struggle with other groups, with other groups of workers across the world in a common struggle, not be ones that are giving charity to workers in less developed countries. Furthermore, like it's not just that the Western left, it's not just the Western worker in this imagination is a charity giver, but he's not even like the primary charity giver. He's a secondary or tertiary subject, which is only understood to act to influence these groups which actually have power. The idea that people can directly do something for Palestine unless they like go and be a charity worker physically there, also isn't something which exists in this discourse. Rather, they have to act to influence these institutions. Like we can appeal to Amnesty International to take a harder line on Palestine, to then for them to take a harder line on the governments that they influence, and so on. And obviously, these governments aren't listening to these NGOs, but this is kind of the tertiary structure where Western workers, which obviously They're barely imagined as workers, even though this is a obstinately left discourse, but rather just as kind of people or the general public are meant to influence these secondary institutions, which then go on to influence these main institutions. It's not just charity, but it's mediated charity. A bit of an underwritten slide. Is there anything positive about the humanitarian discourse? Um, I think I missed talking about it on this slide, but I should have. I would say that they do actually kind of have the moral issue, right? Um, they don't fail to they fail to grasp the subject and like the actors that are involved. Um, but they do have a grasp on at least the moral issue, that they get right, that there's clearly this situation of oppression and violence which isn't particularly complicated. As we when I discuss the mainstream discourse later, there are a lot of people out there who try desperately to make the situation between Israel and Palestine incredibly complicated in this way, which acts to elide some very basic realities about the structure of violence between these two and structure of exploitation between these two states. Jordan Peterson asks, presumably me if I'm a Trotskyite. No, definitely not. Definitely not. Though the next slide might make you think so. The other point with the humanitarian discourse is it's popular. It's in broad alignment with what at least a significant amount of normal people think. And this is another one where lots of Western leftists might not think that this is an obvious virtue, but it very much is an obvious virtue. To the degree it can be, leftist discourse should align with what normal people think. Obviously, to retain its principles, you can deviate from this and must deviate from this, but you should always be reluctant to do so. You should always try to find a way to speak to people's concerns in the way that they understand and want them talked about. And this doesn't necessarily even mean changing policies, it might just mean changing the way you talk about things. And as we get on to talking about the next discourse, we can see why that would, one, can obviously be more alienating to lots of normal people. The other point would be, I think sometimes lacking answers is better than having wrong ones, because it leaves the discourse more open to changing and evolving and getting better. So there's basically a completely lacking discourse in the humanitarian discourse about Hamas, about Hezbollah, about the Houthis, about Triple H, about Iran, about Turkey, about any of this. But that can be positive in the sense that it's much easier to change the discourse where these things are completely open. There's a completely open field in humanitarian discourse for people to go in and try and actually talk about these things. But no, I'm definitely not a trot. Within the TIR network, give them an argument world, I'm definitely the resident Stalinist. This is the other main discourse around Palestine, which is the resistance discourse. The resistance discourse is a major, is a not major, it's a major discourse, but it's a very interesting mix of different things. It's a mix of traditional like Cold War Marxist-Leninist internationalism, Sunni Islamism, and kind of a generic anti-hegemony kind of conspiracy-aligned discourse. In this sort of imagination, Palestinians are active, and they're imagined through the form of a resistance fighter, of the Hamas fighter, or a fighter from another organization. Israel and the IDF are also active, but their reasons for activity are certainly clearer than in the humanitarian discourse, where you'll actually people will say words like colonialism, they'll say words like imperialism, and they'll say words like Zionism, but it's still relatively obscure. Um, this is because the reasoning can be obscure, but also because people won't come out and say what their actual reasoning is, because their actual reasoning is anti-Semitic or Islamist, and they don't want they realize that this won't be appealing to people if they come out and say it, and so they hide behind this more kind of generic leftist discourse. Israel is also kind of more clearly positioned in this discourse compared to the humanitarian discourse as part of a global system of imperialism, but ideas of the tail wagging the dog are quite common. I was just before I came on stream, I was looking at the replies to Donald Trump promising a UFC fighter that he's going to end the war in Palestine. And the one of the top comments was like, "Bro is so cute. He doesn't realize that the U.S. president has to be approved by the Zionists, and by Zionists they of course mean Israelis, before he can become president." The international courts, the UN, NGO statements are used, but they're not the center of the discourse. As an actor, they aren't really important within this discourse. Rather, their statements are used to legitimize the resistance. So the orders of the courts and the UN against Israel are used to kind of legitimize, as well as kind of like the UN Charter and the various UN moves which kind of recognize Palestine and a right of national resistance. These are the kind of the important documents or discursive objects that they use, but they don't really care about the actors themselves. If the UN changed their mind and became like pro-Israeli in some way, or if the ICC had ruled against Hamas but not against Israel, these people would just say, "Well, fuck the ICC," which of course they'd be right about. It's interesting compared to the humanitarian discourse, because in the humanitarian discourse, these regional actors like Hezbollah and Iran don't exist, while in the resistance discourse, they're at the center of the discourse. The Palestinian resistance is not seen as an isolated national resistance, but a part of a regional and then also global struggle against hegemony or struggle against unipolarity. The struggle and its success, and that's important to recognize in this discourse, and it's why it makes the humanitarian discourse seem so bad, because humanitarian discourse seemed basically premised on the idea that the IDF would rapidly conquer and occupy Gaza, but this has not been the reality. Rather, due to the actions of the Palestinian resistance, Israel has consistently failed to occupy a lot of Gaza, and thus were unable to implement plans for ethnic cleansing and genocide. This doesn't exist in the humanitarian discourse. It does exist in the resistance discourse, where this struggle is seen as a victorious struggle. I think that's also an important thing to talk about, and why the resistance discourse seems appealing. When you see it online, the discourse is a triumphant discourse, constantly talking about Israeli defeats, deaths, and so on, even by the fact that, of course, they will talk about Palestinian deaths, but the emphasis is continually on defeats suffered by the IDF, which is interesting, especially because it's not purely cope. The IDF has suffered a lot of reversals, has done way, way worse than anyone has expected, and 9 months in still has failed to take control of large parts of Gaza, has withdrew from the north time after time, and has really, really struggled. Western protesters are generally not that important in this discourse. They certainly are there, um, and it's taken that there is. I think what's positive about this discourse compared to the humanitarian discourse is there's a more clear back and forth between what's going on in the West and what's going on as these regional actors, where the Western protesters, the Western kind of minority, which are taken to be progressive, are kind of a corollary to this resistance struggle. They want their country to be part of these resistance axes, but they aren't able to do it. They aren't able to make that be the case. But they would want, they'd want the United States to be allied to Iran and then nuke Israel, or you know. I'm so thirsty. What is wrong with resistance discourse? I spoke quite a lot in the previous section about what's positive about it compared to the humanitarian discourse, but what's wrong with it. Both in Palestine and more broadly, the left is at best a minority group among resistance, leaving the left as cheerleaders for Islamists. So the PLFP are one of the resistance factions in Palestine, which are a significant armed faction of Marxist-Leninists. Um, the Marxist-Leninist left does better in Palestine than in basically all Western countries, and we shouldn't forget that the Palestinian left very much exists, is active militarily and otherwise, but in the end it's a minority which has ended up in an alliance with Islamists, and I'm not critical of that, but we shouldn't pretend it's somehow more based than if they were able to control their own destiny. They didn't have to ally with Islamists. The fact that PLFP is armed by Iran is better than if they weren't armed by Iran, but is a lot worse than if they were armed by the Soviet Union or by China in some imaginary future. And this leaves the left in a situation where they're cheering for Islamists. People will try and get around it, but in the end, they're saying like, "Oh, this guy from Hamas's base, this guy from Islamic Jihad is based," which of course, lots of the individuals will be, incredibly heroic guys. But in the end, the situation where you end up cheering for Islamists is obviously strange for Western leftists to be doing generally, but specifically is also bad because, well, it makes you seem like there's this conspiracy of like a Marxist Islamist conspiracy to take over the West, um, and this kind of discourse feeds into that discourse and makes it seem like it's actually true that kind of the Marxist Leninists. Well, I guess it is true for the PLFP. They are actually allied to Islamists, but that's generally not the situation, and it's not the optimal situation. I'm not particularly critical of the PLFP, really. I was critical. We should be critical of certain campaigns that got up to in the early 2000s where they were basically targeting Israeli civilians. But recently, I'm not critical of anything they've done really, but rather just acknowledging full-throated in our support for the PLP, but acknowledging that they are a minority group. The other factor that comes along with this is that means with this kind of generic approach, it means that the discourse is also filled with non-leftist ideas. This becomes very evident when we try and talk, when this kind of discourse tries to talk about, well, why actually is Israel doing this? Why actually is the United States supporting this? And going like really, the US isn't just supporting Israel, but like they're trying to embarrass, they're being embarrassed by the degree to which they support Israel. So in this discourse, is colonialism and Zionism a form of capitalist exploitation? Is it racist villainy for its own sake? Is it some kind of crusade against Muslims? Within this discourse, it's unclear. It also means it's unclear what there is for Western workers in this model. There's a song from the 1970s from Italy, which is a very good song about Palestine, which, it has the line, every bullet fired in Palestine strikes the boss in Italy, because Fatah at that time were a socialist. I don't know if they were a Marxist group, but they were part of kind of this international global left. And the struggle there was seemed obviously very common with the one in the West. But how is the struggle of Hamas against Israel in common with me? They aren't a leftist organization. They aren't a progressive organization. They aren't struggling for a socialist Palestine. Um, the very best that they're struggling for is for Palestine to be like just another country, which I'd be very happy for Palestine to become just another country. It'd be a lot better than the situation that they're in. What did your fighting with Kurds have to do with Western workers? Well, of course, my fighting with Kurds had to do with Western workers, because they were a socialist international organization who invited socialist internationalists to aid in a socialist struggle against fascism, which is not what is happening in Gaza. That's not just me getting mad randomly. Again, that's someone from the Give Me an Argument chat. All struggles for socialism help each other, Jason. Concretely, I've already covered that. I should also note that there's different levels to this. So there's kind of speaking ambiguously as to appeal to like kind of radical Western Muslims in such a way that you appeal both to kind of leftists and Islamists. And that leads to then Islamists being in the same discursive environment as you, join in your discourse, which makes it more popular. But in the same time, then they start to use the discourse, and that pushes it further in this Islamist direction. And this can have a cascading effect where you end up basically, thinking you're doing this base leftist discourse, and then a few weeks later you're talking about like the caliphate. What's positive with the resistance discourse? As I mentioned kind of when I was discussing it, its features, most of which is positive about the resistance discourse, is in comparison to the humanitarian discourse. There's some actual effort to grapple with the why of the Israeli settler colony, the why of the Gaza war, which basically doesn't exist in the humanitarian discourse. The factual reality of the Palestinian resistance and of the regional resistance is actually portrayed in this discourse. The IDF's military failures are like something which is incredibly important to talking about what's happened in the past 9 months, but doesn't exist in the humanitarian discourse because it can't exist in the humanitarian discourse. Because what would they be failing against? Because in the humanitarian discourse, the resistance doesn't exist. So how can the IDF fail? Fail against who? Fail against what? Against the kids? Against the doctors, against the poets, against the journalists? In the humanitarian discourse, the resistance doesn't exist, so the military failures can't exist. And then there's just this gaping hole in this discourse where it just ends up making no sense at all. And the final positive point is the existence of the Palestinian left as sometimes acknowledged, which definitely doesn't exist in humanitarian discourse. But I'd also say that from looking at resistance discourse stuff, it doesn't actually exist that often. Like the amount of discussion, I don't know. I don't want to give away what I spend all the time listening to, but I don't think Chapo Trap House in all their episodes in Palestine has ever once mentioned the PLFP. They'll talk about what Hamas fighters and Islamic Jihad fighters have got up to, but they don't talk about PLFP. And some people I follow on Twitter will talk about PLFP, but that's kind of because I've specifically selected to do that. But in most kind of, even from leftists, I don't hear that much who engage in the resistance discourse. I don't hear that much about PLP. I think because they aren't posting base videos of them sniping Israeli snipers. Partially because they're a relatively marginal faction, and partially because from following their social media, they're really struggling to put stuff out due to the conditions in Gaza. What are the mainstream discourses around Israel? I didn't know if this slide was really necessary, but I think it's kind of interesting and fun to talk about. Um, a classic discourse, which you don't hear about that much now, but was like a really big one, um, is the idea that the conflict in Palestine, as opposed to being something which started 80 years ago, is that instead it's this ancient eternal conflict that's incomprehensible to any outsider. Um, and this is something which I'll discuss later when we talk about kind of the issue of genocide. Sorry, someone said, seems like people not paying attention to the INLA or IRSP in Northern Ireland, in the north of Ireland, because the provisional IRA was big and shiny. Yeah, I think it's exactly the same sort of thing, where people won't talk about the actual Marxist-Leninist groups who fought in the Troubles, and instead they'll just talk about the provisional IRA because the provisional IRA had better marketing and killed more people. But the ancient internal conflict discourse is a thought terminating cliche. It's basically a way for people to end the discourse, to not talk about further, which has become less popular these days because people really want to talk about October 7th, and the idea that there's going to be a genocide of Israelis if we don't stop giving them 1,000 billion ton bombs 100 million times a day. Which leads into the next one, which is especially popular now, which is the idea of Israel as a bulwark of liberalism and democracy against terrorism and fascism. And of course, at least in some ways, the Israeli government can look better than Hamas, though often this discourse has to just make stuff up. It has to make up the idea that Hamas throws homosexuals off the roof of buildings in Gaza, which is, of course, completely false. They have to make up the idea that Hamas are sectarians in the way that the Islamic State were, and that you can't be a Christian in Gaza, which is, of course, false. Or they have to, instead of going with the actual bad things which happened on October 7th, they have to make ones up about babies getting beheaded or whatever. There's also efforts to make it problematic that there even is a discourse around Israel. This is another kind of thought terminating cliche, or just an effort, like an anti discourse, where you attempt to position Israel as a country which is just the same as any other country, which is just defending itself, which is just doing what any other country would do if it had been October 7th. And the only reason that people are talking about Israel more than any other country is because they're anti-Semitic. Or they might not be that crude, but they'll basically hint at that. And it's, of course, this strange discourse where people will be like, oh, if your country was attacked like Israel was on October 7th, it would react in a crazy way. And it's like, yeah, Guys, imagine like what would happen if an Islamist jihadist group had killed 3,000 Americans in New York using some kind of plane that they hijacked. Wouldn't America react in a crazy way? And it's like, yeah, and they'd be wrong to do so. Just as Israel, it makes perfect sense that they've engaged in this incredibly vicious, long term, brutal military campaign, but it's still bad. Um, then they do kind of exploitation of the Holocaust, where basically you say it doesn't matter what Israel does now, it doesn't matter how bad they are. In the end, there has to be an Israel. Hamas is an existential threat to Israel. It's interesting that compared to the humanitarian discourse, the mainstream discourse does actually give a role to Hamas and the resistance factions. But it actually, compared to the resistance factions, they probably even think more highly of Hamas in the sense that Hamas suddenly has in this kind of mainstream discourse the power of genocide, the power to wipe Israel off the map, despite the fact that Israel has 200 nuclear weapons and so on and so on. There is now some kind of emerging mainstream anti-Israeli discourse, which focuses on humanitarian ideas. I take it, but it's not really clear like what its features are at the moment. At least not to me. I haven't really been paying enough attention, maybe, to that sort of discourse. Um, all the kind of mainstream discourses around Israel that I'm familiar with are still the pro-Israeli ones. Taking a step back, why should the left care about Palestine? Look, it wasn't just clickbait. I am actually talking about the question in the title. I like the idea Charles Ghost is suggesting that there's spoilers. Is this the sort of thing which has spoilers? I don't know. The most basic argument for why the left should care about Palestine is because lots of people care about Palestine. Lots of Western workers care about Palestine. And that's the kind of thing which the right will say is what kind of leftists believe but isn't true. But very much at the moment, it's true that especially among young people, a very big group of Western workers, especially young workers, care very much about what's happening in Palestine. Um, in the United States, in Seattle, I think, there's this place called the Wing Luke Museum, which is an Asian American museum. And the workers there recently went on wildcat strike and have closed the place for like 2 weeks now because the museum wanted to put up a plaque which was written by the local Jewish group about kind of what's recently, like it was a comparative thing of like the local black organization was going to say the recent black history of black people in Seattle is this and this, and then the Jewish group and the Asian American group and so on, which are going to put up a plaque. And the Jewish American group was like, well, we're going to put a plaque saying that there's been pro Hamas protests on college campuses. And this obviously led to the young people who work there being like, I'm not going to tolerate that. I'm not going to live with that. I'm not going to have a plaque in my own museum which says that I'm Hamas, or that I'm anti-Semitic. I'm not going to tolerate working under those conditions, and so they went on strike. And so it's not just that Western workers are concerned about what's happening in Palestine, but they're also very much concerned about the repressive reaction in the West to their support for Palestine, and they're concerned about themselves being smeared and insulted and so on in this way. There's also a very straightforward moral dimension. What's going on in Palestine is concretely very bad, and we shouldn't just deny moralism in all its forms. I'll talk about moralism more later. And it's notable that no one can really disagree with this. There's not like a. The only way you can deny that what's going on in Palestine is bad is to construct a scenario in which like children are morally culpable for the actions of Hamas, glow, or they'll grow up to be jihadists or whatever, so that they should be killed. If you don't deny kind of the basic humanity of Palestinians, I shouldn't say that because it's generic humanitarian language. If you don't deny the basic kind of moral worth of Palestinians, that they are moral actors, moral patients, in the way that every other human is, there's just no way to deny what's going on there is bad. The only other way to do it is to say like kind of it's a tragic necessity, or to go and say, well, you can also do denial. You can say it's not as bad as it's portrayed, that the numbers are fake, that they're a lot lower than they say they are. Um, but there's not much other way to do it. But of course, there's plenty of very bad things that happen in the world. There's a lot of very bad stuff happening in Sudan right now, in the Darfur, and not just in the Darfur. In it's kind of the wars coming home in Sudan in a lot of places. It's returning, it's not just in Darfur, but it's in the river valley. But Palestine is, in a real sense, something of a linchpin on a kind of material level and on an ideological level. So while we're discussing left discourse around Palestine, we should acknowledge that the whole thing going on in Palestine, the situation in Palestine, is causing a lot of problems for the hegemonic discourse. The hegemonic discourse of Western imperialism got a real boost after the war in Ukraine started. Finally, West really had this thing of like, we're confronting authoritarian governments who are going to do aggressions against democracy. And Russia, they jumped off the roof for the West. They were like, yeah, fuck yeah, we are. And, they invaded Ukraine. And this was a real boost to the West in discursive terms. Actually, in concrete terms, in material terms, it's been pretty devastating for them. Their attempt to sanction war with Russia has gone terribly for them. But ideologically, it was great for the West because it left them in a situation where they could portray themselves as, the defenders of the oppressed. And then Palestine happened, and then October 7th happened, and then Israel invaded Gaza, and they could no longer portray themselves in any reasonable way as the defenders of the oppressed. Before going on to discuss kind of what I think would be a better way to talk about Palestine, I'm going to go through some more marginal left discourse around Palestine. There's probably a lot more of these. And I'm not sure these three even got examples. But I can really think of them. Maybe people in chat will say. So there's a cynical kind of world system view, which you might see from like Damage magazine and people like this, where they will have like a useful, sensible kind of understanding of how Palestine exists in global context of imperialism, capitalism, but then they just kind of leave it at that. And they'll say like, well, on that basis, there's not really any way for Western workers to intervene in the struggle. And that's why I call it a cynical discourse. There's also the left marginalist discourse, which is popular with a certain kind of Trotskyite or pseudo-Trotskyite, where you'll focus on some marginal group in Palestine, some marginal group of leftists who might be part of some common international, as the organization you support in the West, and say, Western leftists should support this group. But I think this is actually less common with Palestine than on other issues, though I'm not really clear why that's the case. Um, and then there's the other sort of cynical view, which is where we should engage with Palestine purely for the sake, well, not purely for the sake, uh, but basically for the sake of promoting our highly marginal Western leftist group as part of like a popular wedge issue. Um, yeah, true. There are people will point out that there's also the anti-Deutsch position, but don't get me started on anti-Deutsch. Man, bomber Harris do it again, but only kill them. Um, and obviously, the cynical idea has the problem that any cynical view does, which is it can't become hegemonic. Because if in your little cult, you can be like, oh yeah, we should engage with the Palestine issue for the sake of promoting our group. But that can't ever become an out an outward facing discourse. When you get people into your cult and then they see you're cynical, they're like, oh, well, that this discourse can't prosper, it can't spread. It's not a functional, useful discourse. Even for the groups that kind of try to do it, I don't think any group has ever kind of grown through a cynical engagement of a wedge issue like this. What would a better left discourse on Palestine look like? And obviously, this is the bit where I look the most silly because it's much easier to criticize than it is to think of anything positive. Um, I think the three important parts of it is to try and understand, and this is obviously, I use this to say that each, in the two main discourses I talked about and the three marginal discourses I talked about, I think each of these features are present to some degree or another. And kind of through a combination of them, I nearly called this video like threading several needles because I think the right features of a discourse around Palestine are present across these discourses, but they aren't all in one place at once. So it's obviously very important to understand the relative importance and place of Palestine and Israel in the global situation of capitalist imperialism. To also to reject any moral blackmail that amounts to an end of thought. Epistemological intimidation. That's interesting. While being so rejecting kind of any thought terminating moral blackmail, but also having something to offer in terms of the very real moral outrage felt by a great deal of Western workers. But also within the local context of the conflict, to understand and acknowledge what concretely Israelis and Palestinians do and want as the most important thing for kind of the evolution, the future, the present, and the past of the conflict. Where is Israel, Palestine concretely in the global context of capitalism and imperialism? I saw some claims at the start of the war that they died out. I don't think they spread because they seem obviously silly. That Israel's interest in Gaza and the general interest from the imperialists in Gaza is one of like an effort to gain resources to strip the Gazan sea zone of gas, which I think they have some proven supply, but it's not anything which is worth anything like what has been done in the past 9 months. And of course, We should remember that October 7th, while Hamas didn't start the Israel-Palestine war, they started this round. It was their initiative. It was their action. And erasing that is the same kind of denial of the active role of Palestinians, as is unfortunately done by the humanitarian discourse. The important, why is Israel important for the United States? Why, if we aren't conspiracy theorists, if we aren't anti-Semitic, why is Israel important for the United States? There obviously is just this factor of there's a very significant Israeli lobby in the United States, which has an outmoded influence, and it's just kind of this circular process. But there's also a concrete reality. A lot of people would just be like, no, they didn't start this round. Yeah, of course they did. Like, what the fuck are you saying? Um, like, you saying like October 7th just didn't happen? Was it imaginary? Like, it's not embracing the name. I'm just arguing with someone in chat, sorry, which half the viewers can't see. But then you're just like, oh, there's a long track of attacks before this. Why do you think I said this round and not before? Like, shouldn't get mad at people in chat when half people can say. Yeah, there was this previous event, the Great March of Return, which was the previous, like that was the previous thing. What's wrong with it? And then people are just doing semantics about like what is around. So the importance for Israel for the United States is it as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It's a necessary part of the United States Middle East strategy. Compared to other US allies in the Middle East, Israel is taken as rock solid. That there could be regime change. So it's important to emphasize that the United States has a lot of allies in the Middle East, but they're universally autocracies. Israel is only allied, sorry, the United States is only allied to the least democratic Arab states because Arab public opinion is against normalization with Israel. In all the countries, all these kind of Gulf states have normalized with Israel. Israel is despised in these countries. And it's only in these non democratic places, which could then be overthrown and turn against the United States and Israel, that the US has allies. And so Israel is really important, despite kind of being a problem for the United States in the sense that it causes, by being allied with Israel, the United States is hated a lot more than it would be otherwise in the Middle East. But Israel is important because it's someone that's actually, public opinion is actually behind an alliance with the United States, while in all the rest of the Middle East, it's not. Oh dear. Right, I need to. Okay. So the importance for Israel, for the United States, is it provides a basis for its regional exploitation of the Middle East, which, the issue of oil is actually important here. The colonization of Palestine, on the other hand, is not actually important in global terms, beyond the degree to which it's a contradiction for Israel. The problem, the only kind of importance for the United States of Gaza, for Gaza and for the West Bank and so on, is the degree to which Palestine causes problems for Israel, which then causes problems for Israel being accepted in a normal country. The problem for the United States is not that they're like, oh, we need to defeat Hamas and conquer Gaza. The problem is that as long as this war goes on, then they can't normalize between Israel and Saudi, and they can't have this neat alliance sorted out between their mates. But the fact that I'm being accused of doing imperial propaganda in chat is a good sign because it shows I am threading the needle between these different discourses. And it's important to emphasize that while the US is trying to pivot away from the Middle East, this doesn't make Israel less important. This makes Israel more important because pivoting away from the Middle East doesn't mean giving up on the exploitation of the Middle East. What it means is hoping that regional actors, which are allied with the United States, can do the imperial enforcement in these regions instead of the United States having to do them. They want to calm things down so that their exploitation can go on peacefully. You know, they want things to be quiet so that they can focus on other things. I've drank all my water, guys. I've drank all the massive bottles. I'm just gonna have to be thirsty for the rest of the stream. Oh no, wait, I've got a tiny bit. I think there's a subjective factor of Joe Biden. I think otherwise they might have put a lot more pressure on them earlier. But at the moment, I mean, just a couple of days ago, the US tried to bounce Israel into a ceasefire where they announced, this is Israel's ceasefire proposal. Hamas, you have to accept it. And Hamas was like, yeah, sure, we accept it. And then Israel was like, that wasn't our proposal, that was fake. I think there was like a lot of overconfidence in the IDF. And lots of people point this out. I think basically Joe Biden and his close team expected that Israel would knock this out in a month. And then it wouldn't really be a problem. It certainly wouldn't last until like the middle of the election year. And I think each kind of month they were like, well, okay, they'll win soon, right? They'll win soon, right? They'll win soon, right? I think going forward, Israel will be a lot less likely to support kind of the cleansing of the helots that Israel does in Gaza. But for this round, they had this delusional idea based on previous conflicts with Hamas that Hamas couldn't fight and that they would be able to quickly conquer them. And it was based on this kind of false assumption that the US kind of went so full in for the United States. Scrolling back to chat. What is the state of local capitalist relations in Israel Palestine? Gaza should be interesting for any Marxist noting the evolution of capitalism. What's happening in the West Bank is it's like happens in plenty of places. It's actually probably very similar to the situation in South Africa in apartheid, where it's basically this Bantustan. The Palestinian authorities are puppet government, and the people in the West Bank are exploited for their labor within the West Bank in terms of working for Israeli enterprises who operate in the West Bank and then export things to the West saying like made in Palestine on it when really they're made by Israeli companies. Or they're literally just made in Israeli settlements. They're being, and then also being, their labor is being exploited as they're exploited for less paid well workers. I've forgotten the term, like marginal workers in the Israeli economy, while at the same time being settler colonialized in this kind of most gauche, straightforward, kind of blatant, like military and police and guns and murder and demolition manner. Gaza is not like this at all. And Gaza, I think, is a really unique situation where there was a minor degree of labor exploitation, and Hamas deliberately kind of encouraged Israel to think that they really cared about the small degree of labor exploitation. But it was never a significant part of the Palestinian, of the Gazan economy. And Israel has consistently treated Gaza for a long time as a population of helots, which they mow the grass, where they basically have this institutional policy of occasional slaughter of some segment of the population there. But what is notable is that there is a Gazan economy, and it's not a super low income economy, despite these waves of terror. Um, it's a middle economy globally, propped up entirely by international aid, and it's not just a middle economy, but it's a middle economy with a population which is much more educated than you would expect from that level of economy. So Gaza is a middle economy globally, but they have a population which is educated nearly as well as some high income countries. Their rates of university graduation have kind of dropped in recent years because I think they kind of peaked 5 years ago or something like that, because there was a point where I think Gazans were getting educated because they're like, well, surely if I get educated, then I can have some kind of good life. And then some people got university degrees, and the occupation was still going on, the blockade was still going on. It was still very hard to emigrate, and I think some people were like, okay, whatever, I'm not. There's no point getting educated in Gaza. But it still has an enormously high graduation rate, but then also an enormous unemployed population. It's like, I think it's almost equal, like 55% university educated, 55% unemployment, something like that, which I'm sure that any young Western worker can sympathize with. And in this way, I think it's useful, to the degree that we can, to not see Gaza. So I said Gaza special, but what I mean when I say Gaza special, I don't mean it's or unique. I don't mean that it's what's going on there is a qualitatively different thing to what's happening everywhere else. Rather, what's going on there is like an extreme form of what's going on elsewhere in the world. This incredibly concentrated violence, this incredibly concentrated, but also at the same time, then there's this destruction of capital there by Israel. But then there's a new flow instantly afterwards of capital from these kind of hyper exploitative resource economies of the Gulf and the United States and elsewhere, which leads to this population which has these extreme features, which are in some ways similar to the conditions that Western workers are in, where you have this massively educated economy, but at the same time, a massive levels of unemployment, which couldn't possibly, like, there's no way for all these people to possibly use their university degrees. And this leads to like a real malaise in Gaza, which I think can also be familiar to Western workers. Yeah, it was good. Yeah, I think that's true. But the issue is, what is there to be seized in Gaza? Um, some others have pointed out. I think this is kind of the line taken up by the what are they called, Platypus and Doug Lane and stuff like this, where they'll make the argument of kind of, our demand should be that Palestinians be allowed to be workers, because at the moment, is if there was some revolution in Gaza where kind of workers rose up and took control of the country, in large part things wouldn't change because they have this situation where it's of course there is a Gazan Palestinian bourgeoisie and so on, but in so large part their economy and their oppression is incredibly externalized. Moralism and genocide. So I don't think any good discourse of leftist discourse around Palestine shouldn't seek to get rid of the moralizing aspects of it. For one thing, it's just not possible. Um, and also, it would make the discourse seem alien and strange and weird to normal people. When, of course, should lead on the fact of what you have common consensus with, which for ordinary people is that what's happening in Gaza is very bad. But we should oppose moralism, the use of moralism, as thought terminating. We can talk about genocide in Gaza. We can talk about the definitions of genocide and to the degree to which the features of Gaza, what's going on there is genocide, or at least attempted genocide. I think, again, to return to the military failure, I think if it wasn't for the Palestinian resistance, Israel would have definitely sought some fucked up weird plan to ethnically cleanse the area. And we heard about these plans. They were leaked to Western media and talked about in the New York Times. But because of the resistance of the Palestinian factions, they could never get off the ground. They never had a chance to go anywhere. But people will use genocide to say not to actually talk about these issues, not to say things are bad, or just to say that. But they'll want to use to say, someone will say like, oh, blah, 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 blah. But it's a genocide, and they'll just want things to end there. That's not a useful discourse because it never gets anyone on your side that's not already convinced. If you're not willing to talk about genocide, and obviously it can be sensitive. Like if you're like, oh, it's genocide, and if someone's like, oh, well, what's wrong with genocide? That can seem like a really like stinging thing for them to say, like a nuts thing to them to say. But you should be prepared to explain. It's like I feel the common example I use here is with racism. I feel like racism has been so demonized. It's not a bad thing. It's been so demonized now in the West that if news presenters or whatever or leftists or whatever, if you're talking to someone and you said, "Oh, what you're saying there is racist," and they said, "Yeah, it's racist. I'm a racist." I think a lot of people would struggle to explain to them why racism is bad. It's not because it's very hard. It's quite easy to explain why racism is bad, but people haven't exercised that muscle. They don't have it as part of their faculties because racism is so unquestionably bad that people don't even bother to think about why it's bad. They don't have reasons to explain why it's bad. For one thing, if you're saying like, oh, it's genocide, and you're expecting that to just end the conversation as opposed to lead to a conversation, there's a real problem in terms of ends because it's not clear what the end of the situation in Palestine being a genocide should be. So we have the ICC and the ICJ and all these groups that are basically saying they're getting to the point of saying that the situation in Gaza is genocide, or there's genocidal acts, or there's a threat of genocide, or whatever. But where does that actually lead us? For this international cause, it doesn't seem much. It seems that they'll rule against Israel, but then they don't have any enforcement mechanism or anything like this. What does it mean? What do we have to do if it's a genocide? What comes after? I think probably the example of, why is a genocide bad seems a bit tortured, but I think it's important to actually be able to explain why it's bad and what that means. If you're saying it's a genocide, then what does that mean? What do we have to do? What comes after? So what is this sketch of a positive discourse around Palestine look like? I think it's important for us to, whenever we can, instead of seeing the Palestinians as aliens, to seek a commonality with them. I think this can be seen when people say things like, well, what would you do if you were in their situation? And that's not just, I think people use that just kind of not thinking about the Palestinians really, but thinking of themselves in the situation, and that can be actually alienating. But I think you can think about it in some way as to realize when you say that, that actually Palestinians are not so different from you. That if you say, what will you do in that situation? Your answer is doing something like what they're doing, then that shouldn't just legitimate what they're doing, but it should make you realize that you and them are not so different. To emphasize a union with the Palestinian left, as well as Palestinians in general, but I've missed out like a without here, but without being deluded about their capacity or thinking that, the fact that PLFP is being armed by Iran is a good thing, as opposed to kind of a regrettable necessity. And I think finally, the most important thing perhaps is to understand, and I think this is the way to avoid any problems with anti-Semitism or anything like this, is to understand the Palestinian case as a particularly egregious example of regional and global contradictions and tensions and capitalism and imperialism. And the same goes for Israel. Rather than anything magical, rather than the center of the world, we shouldn't be deluded into thinking this issue is like decisive one way or another. People will say things, especially within like the resistance discourse, where it's like, oh, defeating Israel means defeating capitalism. It's like, no, it doesn't. Like, not at all. Like, yeah, it would be a blow. It would be a real blow to the United States Middle Eastern strategy if tomorrow Israel disappeared, but it wouldn't really matter that much. It wouldn't like it's not that big of a deal. And I think thinking that is a really dangerous road to start going down. Um, Defeating it's also like we should say that a total defeat of Israel is basically impossible unless you're kind of unless you have your fantasies of Tehran being nuked. And of course, there's a sense of defeating Israel where Israel becomes a single Levantine state with equal rights for Palestinians and Israelis, in which case basically Israel no longer exists. But it's harder to see a time where things have been further from that as we are now. And we're also further from a two-state solution than we have ever been now. But we're certainly very far from that. So yeah, that was my presentation. I don't know if I'll read chat for a while. I don't know how people think of the kind of the PowerPoint style. If the PowerPoint is good, it's good for me certainly. I don't know if it's good for the audience. It's good for me. It compared to kind of reading notes, lets me actually read chat. Jakey saying, yeah, it's got work in the morning. Yeah, I mean, I woke up at 8 a.m. today, so I need to get to bed soon. We're going to get a Jewish leader of a country who doesn't suck. Let's go. There's some goofy images. Like, who put this in here? Oh, that's not those aren't backgrounds though. Yeah, I mean the only background is just the TIR. Actually, I should have used that because it's almost the same grey. Ah, guys. What it Remind me, what was he? Is it this? Or is it? Is it this? Is it this? I guess I say I'm asking for clarification, but there's no way for you to actually like you guys are on video. You can't do it for me. Uh, yeah, I mean, I think there. While I'm saying like all this stuff, I this is a decisive moment for the history of Israel Palestine, which is not to say are going to get better. Things can always get worse, as I often emphasize on this show. But it is a decisive moment. It's a decisive change, and I hope, obviously, I hope things get better. Benny Hill salute. Benny Hill salute. Ah, right. Yes, yes, yes. It's this. I remember. It's this. This is the International Social Salute. These are all just the images that are loose images in the fucking TIR overlays. Yeah, Ben did this by accident, and I just imitated him, and then we declared it the International Social Salute. Yeah, I mean, I think BDS is very important because BDS escapes from this humanitarian idea of spreading awareness. If we have a discourse which tries to emphasize the material or the concrete, BDS is incredibly important because it changes how we talk about what Western workers can do for Palestine, away from saying you need to go on circular marches and raise awareness and write to your congressman, to you can hit Israel right in the pocket. And this, of course, this is what student protesters have been doing. They've been demanding that their universities stop their association with Israeli universities and that they de-invest from arms companies. So yeah, I'm incredibly positive about BDS. So the question of will liberals be more sympathetic? Yeah, I think definitely, um, definitely. I think before the war, like often with BDS, if you talk to normie libs, they'd be like, well, I mean, I think they basically think you're a crank or you're being anti-Semitic or whatever because they're like, well, why Israel? Why? Because that's like a point with Israel, like why are you only doing why are you only boycotting Israel when there's obviously lots of countries which are doing bad things? But the important point with Israel and BDS is Israel is both part of the Western kind of network, is doing really, really bad things, but also is someone that can be plausibly boycotted. If we imagine that the US is doing the same things as Israel is doing, you couldn't do BDS in the United States. It's impossible. It just couldn't happen. While Israel, and this is important to talk about how to emphasize that Israel isn't the most important thing in the world. BDS can only work because it isn't the most important thing in the world. Because they are in this Western network of capitalism imperialism, but they're a relatively marginal part of it. Throw came with the inscrutable agent conflict line just before we end. Okay, folks, I'm gonna be off. Thank you all for watching. I think that was good. That was exciting. I shouldn't say it's fun because I mean I don't know. I find it fun even though I'm talking about grim things. Bye everyone.